Here in Brussels, I'm joined by Mathieu Denis, he's the acting CEO and science director at the International Science Council. And with him, Luc Sautet is professor emeritus and former rector magnificus at University of Maastricht. Online, we also have two more speakers, and I told you there was an international panel. What it is? Beyond Kiev, we also have Pretoria, represented online with Dan Dutoit. Dan is Deputy Director General for International Cooperation and Resources at the Department of Science and Innovation at the Government of South Africa. And live from Japan, Yuko Arayama. Yuko is the co-chair of the Japanese Association for the Advancement of Science. She's also a professor emeritus at Tohoku University. Thank you very much for joining us. We will see very soon the speakers on the screen so that we have the full panel. And I'd like to go straight on with you two, Luc and Mathieu. You've heard just what Olga said about Russians, about sanctions against Russian universities and research organizations. To quote her, she's not very interested. What is your position? What do you think should happen, and what do you think the West should be doing next, and what do you think about this, the sanctions against Russia?
Should I start?
Yes, please, Mathieu, you go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. Well, first of all, there's no doubt in my mind that the very first and utmost priority is to come and support and help the best we can the Ukrainian scientists, refugee and displaced Ukrainian scientists at the moment, to provide protection as much as we can, to develop support programs, to help with mobility of scientists and researchers, and to help Ukraine rebuild a modern science ecosystem, institutions, and reinstate Ukraine in the global scientific enterprise. Now, your questions about Russia. My perspective on that issue is not that of an organization that is primarily a Western organization or a European organization. I work for the International Science Council, which is the world's leading non-governmental scientific organization, and we're a federation of independent scientific organizations present in over 140 countries worldwide. And we have the ambition of being the global voice for science, so speaking for the global scientific community. And as a global scientific community, we have certain shared responsibilities. One is to preserve the capacity of science to produce knowledge that helps societies addressing global challenges. Another one is to advance science as a global public good. We also share a responsibility in advancing, defending the free and responsible conduct of science. So that's the perspective, that's the position, that's where I'm talking from. Now, for Russia specifically, I see essentially three priorities at this moment in time. The first one is that where it is not already done, I think that the support program, the mobility programs that are currently in place should be open to Russian scientists currently fleeing their country because of the war. The second one is that we must, probably sanctions are inevitable, and in any case sanctions are there, but we must protect certain spaces where Russian scientists can participate in international collaborations, where they can publish, where they can participate in conferences and committees. Mm-hmm. And the third one is that I think we need to lead an assessment of the effect of the sanctions on Russian science and try and really evaluate their overall impact at the local level in Russia, but also at the global level. Are the sanctions helping us as a global scientific community advance any of our joint shared responsibilities, such as the ones that I've mentioned? We don't know. Is there any evidence that the sanctions are impeding, reducing, weakening the capacity of Russia to lead its aggression war on Ukraine? We don't know. There is, however, evidence, but that would need to be measured, that the sanctions are affecting deeply and weakening seriously the Russian scientific system. Now, by doing that, I think we must realize as a global community that we're also weakening our global capacity to address challenges such as climate, where we need data from around the world in order to be effective, the Arctic, ocean, marine stations. So there's a cost, there's a global cost to pay to sanctions, and I think we need to assess that. And
So
clearly,
does that relate just to the area where you said we need to keep the channel, the communication channels?
well, that would be a
open?
very good way to start, is to keep cooperation in the areas where there's already collaboration and where the benefits of collaboration are obvious to everyone.
But the assessment of the sanctions, is it something that the International Science Council could carry, or who do you see?
Well, obviously that's something that needs to be done by a network and coalition of people. But clearly, as International Scientific Council, we do see the importance of partnering with people and measuring that in due time, definitely.
Okay, we'll come back to some of the ISC recommendations in just a little while. Luc, what is your view? What do you think the West should do?
Well, I think first of all, the issue is it's easy talk for us. We're sitting here in our different research labs, and you hear the stories about the numbers of research labs destroyed, the impact on human life. So from that perspective, I think that my first point is, of course, that all the sympathy for Ukraine, and in particular the recognition that this is something which already started in 2014. And we never cared the period 2014 till the February 24th. And so we never had any discussion about research collaboration with Russia before 24th. So this is something we should realize, that in many areas, and this is one where we could have used much more science diplomacy with Russia at that time to put much more pressure. We didn't. On the sanctions, of course, there is the assumption that, and I think this is where I would follow Denis, and I would say to Olga also, that, you know, scientists are different from sportsmen. They're also different from trade and other goods, etc. And when you put in sanctions where you hope they might work, which is still very much open for discussion, look at what we hear about oil and gas, how it comes back to Europe at a much higher price to China. Similarly, with say, artists or with sportsmen, scientists are, in my view, still a very different sort of people. They're people who, in principle, if they follow their scientific research, are open, want transparency in their research, don't like to be instructed. I'm really talking here about the science, etc. And this openness and transparency in terms of research, building on the others, building on the shoulders of giants, etc., is something which is characteristic of the whole movement towards global science and towards open science. And that brings back that there are many areas where, indeed, Russian scientists have been instrumental. And you mentioned the Arctic, you mentioned the various other marine centers and other areas where the withdrawal or the institutional withdrawal from Russian science in there has a price. We pay a price. And so whereas I understand the institutional sanctioning of research institutions, I still follow the need that in terms of the individual scientist, we possibly might even do exactly the opposite. Why don't we have a real policy that we attract Russian brains in the sense of really generating a brain drain out of Russia to strengthen our science basis and to actually sanction the Russian science system by trying to pick or steal their best brains,
Okay.
so to say, as a sort of complete opposite direction. I know that there have been discussions about this. The question is, of course, how do you implement it? But to sort of push forwards towards the spirit of what brings scientists together. And I still believe very much that democracy and openness and not being instructed what to do is a characteristic of scientists.
Okay, but even inside Europe, there were very different reactions among European countries. Not talking about the other countries around the world and on the west side. So yeah, I wonder if actually a unified approach is even an option. We don't have the connection, I think, with the other two. I don't have any instructions, so I don't know. They are here. Fantastic. Sorry, I couldn't see you. So, Yuko and Dan, I come to you now, and Rich, then you can pick up the discussion. But just South Africa and Japan, in the two cases, governments have left entirely to the institution to decide what to do, whether to cut ties with Russian universities or not. So, and the two countries have done very different, had very different approaches. What is your view about sanctions, and how should the international science community behave towards Russian scientists? Dan, do you want to go first?
Thank you very much, Marilyn, and thank you for this opportunity to participate in this very important discussion. I mean, South Africa attaches great importance to international cooperation in science. I'm sure everyone in this gathering agrees that throughout the ages, international cooperation has permitted science to progress. I'm sure we also all agree, and Mathieu referred to this, that international cooperation in science is absolutely crucial in order to respond to the many shared global challenges we face, whether it's pandemic disease, whether it's climate change, whether it's food security. And I'm also, for South Africa, in that context, we are concerned on how geopolitical global developments, whether those are conflicts or others, can negatively impact on humanity's ability to really harness the full potential of science, to defeat poverty and to create a more sustainable world we all would want. Now, Mathieu introduced himself explaining the International Science Council. When you spoke, Marilyn, you also said I'm a South African government official. Indeed, I am. And also as a government official, there are, of course, certain protocols when we speak on the conduct of relations between different governments of foreign policy issues. I will not comment on the foreign policy issue specific, which is by the prerogative of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but focus very much on what you've asked me to do. And that is how we view international cooperation in science within this context. And we really would like to call for three values, three principles, which we think are absolutely crucial, whether we speak about the current conflict or other global situations. And that's in the first instance, and Luc spoke about it, and Mathieu speak about it. I mean, let's put into practice the values of open science, which we often speak about. South Africa strongly believes we are deeply committed to multilateralism, and indeed we are concerned about a future for multilateralism. So we believe that established structures, the established global governance structures, specifically those of the United Nations, should be used to also consider on how we respond to issues like this, so that we have an open discussion, that we have a transparent discussion, and we have a consistent discussion on the response to different global crises we find.
Dan,
we also believe.
Can I come in?
Yeah?
I just have a question on the impact of sanctions. In the South African history during apartheid, there were sanctions against South African universities. Yeah. So what's the history? What can the history teach us?
So indeed, I think in our country's history, first of all, what history can teach us, and that was going to be my second point, is communication. And this is what South Africa has consistently called for, also for the current crisis, for conflict to be resolved through communication, through dialogue. That was a very important contributing factor which resulted in South Africa's peaceful transition to democratization. But you are entirely correct, and South Africans will never forget the huge support and friendship we had during the difficult years of apartheid, where the apartheid regime was isolated through sanctions, and that enabled change. So indeed, sanctions is a tool of foreign policy, and it is for governments concerned with matters such as in the case of apartheid, which was a crime against humanity, to decide on how best to deploy those instruments. What I could again just say that from a science, from an international science perspective. In the current case, South Africa continues to work with the Russian Federation as we continue to work with Ukraine. And what we call for is collaboration and engagement through multilateral structures and open discussion and dialogue.
All right, thank you, Dan. Maybe, Rich, actually, I hand back to you and let you bring Yuko in the discussion.
Okay, all right, fine. Yuko, I'll be with you in just a minute. I will just add one thing from our own research. We have been conducting an online survey of researchers around the world. So far, we have 38 countries represented, researchers from 38 countries in this survey. We are continuing the survey online on our homepage, so go to it and please take it. It's anonymous. But the question is, so what do you think about the sanctions? And at the moment, not to give it away, because it's still in process, but of course, not surprisingly, the majority agree that there should be sanctions against Russian science. The quotes, however, the anonymous quotes are very interesting. For instance, on the side of supporters of sanctions, one says, science cannot be apolitical. Science cannot be apolitical. That's in contradiction to some of the points that some of our panelists were making about, not everybody agrees that scientists are any different than sportsmen or artists. So that's one point. Another point is then from those who are against sanctions is the argument that you have heard in the panel so far. Science has always been a bridge, says one respondent. It's important to keep scientific and research cooperation alive in all circumstances. And then there's one other similar quote that's a little bit shorter that says, the Iron Curtain again? No thanks. Anyway, there's a huge range of opinion. Please take the survey online. But the bigger question ultimately then is to Yuko, come to you on this issue, either on the subject specifically of Russian sanctions or on, more importantly, I think, a concern of yours, what about the next conflict? What is the appropriate conduct for such for the scientific community in dealing with a crisis like this?
Thank you for having me today for you.
Yes, it's unfair time zone.
I'll be talking on my personal view, on my behalf, not official position. The question, what best to do, that including Japan, and the view from Japan far away from Europe. So we don't see physically nearby. But in general, my view is that we have to protect and defend science community, share practice of science anywhere without distinction, without the border, in particular now in Ukraine. So the question is, how about Russia? We see the reactions in multiple levels. For example, in Japan, instead of talking about sanctions, we prefer to have statements declaring against the invasion and expressing the solidarity with Ukraine. Other reaction, more defensive actions, protecting our nationals living in Russia to make them back home. But also we see some supportive actions, including vis-a-vis Russian scientists and students working and studying in our country without distinctions again. But much stronger, we have sanctions. And not only sanctioning action today, but existing relation, but it's maybe impacting future relation. That's a context. So in general, sanction, majority cases, against institution, but much less about individual will. And we see many scientific institutions attempting to assume institutional responsibility under these unexperienced circumstances. Many pros, many cons against sanctions. Most common view is sanction targeting Russian institutions and much less individuals. This is after the Russian institutions, unions, Richter's open letter. We have been surprised to see them, but also we see the positioning of Russian scientists open letter against invasion. So different letters.
So that, Yuko, if I can interrupt you, that's an important distinction between institutions and individuals. And important, yes. That is to say, in our news coverage of this entire process, we have seen country after country take that line. Institutions, no. Individuals, yeah, it's up to you. Basically, that seems to be the policy.
We see the solidarity with, of course, with Ukrainian researchers, but also many Russian researchers who are in this position today, but fundamentally against invasions. Yeah. So sometimes they are victim of this, what's happening. So we can't evaluate today because so many unknown, so many underlying factors. But just now, what we can do is that we see what's happening is against the Russia practice of openness, collaborations, and solidarities, as mentioned by Luke. But some doubt about the effect of science sanctions because it's different of enforcing economic, financial, political sanctions. But for sure, we see the impact of these sanctions impacting fundamentally our practice or our value or the way we conduct science, not only in Russia, but for us too. So what we need is, yes.
Okay, extrapolate this a little further. You are very close to China. What happens if China invades Taiwan? What happens if some other conflict arises right in your territory? Do you think that the Japanese research institutions will think about it differently then? Is this what we have done with Russia? Is that the template that should be used in all future conflicts or not?
So we do not have any prepared response because today what's happened in Ukraine is really for us unexperienced circumstances. And in China with Taiwan, we see something coming. But for the moment, not real conflict. So we have to really empower our capacity to prepare for this unexpected. And this is the exercise we are doing actually. We need for that kind of self-assessment by the science community, not just picking up some aspect, but having a comprehensive view of what's happening and what are the impacts of these sanctions. It will take time, but we have to proceed in this way, not just reacting to immediate actions. And if it's possible to find kind of common positioning, a kind of basic principles to address these unexperienced, unexpected circumstances.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So Don, if I could come to you for a second here. You said that you think that what should happen is that these are matters for the international institutions to deal with. Well, isn't that a formula for doing nothing?
It's a provocative statement, Richard, and I appreciate and understand why you make it. But it's also a call to action and a call to responsibility to all governments to the world to put into practice what we say when we say we face shared challenges and we have global custodianship and common responsibility of stewardship for the well-being of our nations. We do not see any other alternative. We firmly believe in a commitment, a renewed commitment to multilateralism, and then the strengthening of these institutions, which we then use. I am not for one moment saying they have served us perfectly in the past. I think the COVID-19 pandemic is a good example of instances where they've also worked and where they've not worked. For example, in the complete inequality and access to vaccines, despite what was said on global platforms. So I think that's the responsibility and that's the challenge all of us face. And I just want to quickly add something to what Luc said, because that's important for me. Sitting here as a bureaucrat, I don't want to come across as cold, clinical, because human suffering in whichever part of the region of the world, whether it's from famine, whether it's from disease, whether it's from persecution, that's what should motivate us and that's what should drive us to respond to. And we believe reinforced and renewed global governance, strengthening the United Nations body to respond to these issues, that is what we should be thinking about. We cannot have unilateralism. And certainly what we are concerned about in Africa, in the global south, is the increased polarization. At a time when, as never before, we needed global unity and global solidarity, we see different blocs re-emerging, and countries and continents such as mine being forced by some to choose sides, and we don't think that is useful.
How is that going to affect? How is that going to affect the developing world? We are in two geopolitical.
It's going to affect all of us. It's not only going to affect us. Because if we undermine solidarity, we're going to undermine our ability, what Mathieu and Luc spoke about, to respond to, for example, global climate change. We're going to neglect the responsibility to address the huge poverty inequalities which continue to persist. We're going to undermine what should be a priority for the global science community, and that's to reinforce science capacity building across Africa and the developing countries. So I do not think our world, all of us, not only us in the South, you in the North too, we can't afford this division. I mean, my own country, our own painful history, know what comes from polarization, from division. And now is the call to put into practice that we are stronger if we are together for unity.
Were there, during apartheid, as it rose, as the international protests rose, was all scientific relation cut off?
Not all were cut off. That's a very interesting study which we can talk about. Obviously, most governments didn't maintain bilateral relations with apartheid South Africa. There would have been individual relations, yes, but
individual versus institution.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Olga, before I come back to Marilyn and Luc and Mathieu in the studio, Olga, I know you're dying to say something about this. So if we extrapolate internationally, is what is happening here, the way the scientific community has reacted, is that a template for the future of science or not?
Well, thank you for asking. And as a matter of fact, this is obvious that I'm just, among the panelists, I'm in the minority. And I said about my position and my vision of the scientific sanctions as for researchers from the Russian Federation and Belarus. By the way, we shouldn't forget about this country, which is very supportive in the hostilities. Well, again, it seems to me, we should divide discussing these questions into two levels, I would say. One is very hypothetical, but even here I have some arguments to say. Well, first of all, I have always held an opinion and had always held this opinion before the war started, that science is not an entity which is a part of society. This is a very impressive institution that serves society as such. Again, talking hypothetical, let's move on to the values, represented by science and the responsibility that goes with just representing these values. As a matter of fact, no research, no scientific activity can be done without involvement of individuals, right? So, well, this is just, well, axiomatic, I would say. At the same time, yeah, you're quite right, modern research is impossible without any kind of collaboration. That might be just, well, modest collaboration or collaboration, well, full-scale collaboration on the international level. That's clear, and exchange of information is very important. At the same time, let's come back to the, well, subjects doing research. There's scientists who are citizens. And here I would like just, well, to mention the notion, which is, from my point of view, very relevant here. This is intellectual, well, integrity. Well, we have heard much about research integrity, academic integrity, but here I'm talking about the intellectual integrity. And actually, responding to what just Yuka has mentioned, let me very briefly just, well, read out some quotes to you. As a matter of fact, on the 7th of March, that was the second week of the invasion, the National Research Foundation of Ukraine sent over 40,000 emails to Russian researchers. So we took their emails from open sources, by the way. Thanks, we have open sources. Yeah, so this is just, well, just a plus for open science as a phenomenon. So, well, the latter actually contained an appeal to condemn the unlawful aggression of the state of the Russian Federation. Let me quote just, well, 2 sentences from this appeal. So, well, that actually, this is about the change, the evolution of how we saw that at the beginning of March. Yes, there is no doubt that science must be beyond politics, but science cannot be beyond human morale and norms of the modern civilization. Scientists cannot remain silent when their country is an organizer of a genocide and crimes against humanity. So we asked just, well, these Russian researchers not to be silent, and actually they were not. Out of all the responses we received, only 12% were relatively supportive or at least neutral. The other 88% were very humiliating. Just, well, I will just, well, this is about the individual responsibility. We were not addressing institutions. We were addressing separate researchers. So some quotations from the replies we received, many of them used just, well, obsolete vocabulary. Of course, I wouldn't dare just, well, to quote these things, but at least some of them. So, well, for example, a representative of the Institute of Plant and Animal Ecology, Ural branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences. What Nazis getting scorched? See what will happen next, beasts. The next one coming from Belgorod, which is next to Kharkiv, which is heavily shelled and bombed since the beginning of the war, since the first day of the war. Belgorod National Research University. Don't write to me again. You shouldn't have spread fascism with the help of grunts. You must die, fascist henchmen. Another one coming from St. Petersburg State University. By the way, that researcher comes from Graduate School of Management. I'm proud of my country, Russia. Our aim is denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. You'd better write letters to the European Union and the USA. And the last one from UFA, Institute of Chemistry of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Drive to hell your Bandera followers from Kharkiv and create a new life, just as it used to be when we all lived in the Soviet Union. Why on earth are you appealing to us? We know perfectly well who is who. Do you think we're going to overthrow Putin now? But we need Russia protected from Ukraine now. And what about bacteriological laboratories of Yankee soldiers in your country? So, well, I don't think that we need any further comments upon that. Again, I just, well, would like just to draw your attention to the fact that we were addressing individual researchers. Okay. And so this is a kind of a survey. Yeah, well, but just, well, the numbers are quite big. We did a lot of work. And as a matter of fact, so hypothetically discussing this is maybe not the time. Maybe we should do that a little bit later. And now it's the time to concentrate, yes, to concentrate on just, well, cutting off all connections with research in the Russian Federation. Besides being an insider and a person who was born in the ex-Soviet Union, I can put my hand on my heart and tell you that not a single researcher in the Russian Federation who is considered to be a distinguished researcher, one with titles, awards, a grantee, and so on and so forth, well, nobody can get all these privileges in case this person, this particular person, again, I'm not talking about an institution, has very good connection to the administration and actually is close to all those privileges. So this is how it worked in the ex-Soviet Union.
Well, yes, of course, it is.
Sorry for being very emotional.
No, it's a frighteningly difficult time for many people right now. Thank you for that, Olga. Marilyn, I hand back to you, to your panelists in the studio.
Yeah, thank you. And we're indeed slowly approaching the end of this session. And I think what we want to do next is just to draw some clear recommendations. Well, there's actually one question from the chat, and this is for you, Luke, and this is in very deep contrast with what we just heard. But I'll raise it to you, and then we run just for final recommendations. So the question says, I read it out, the cost of war has already sanctioned Russian science, and there is little money allocated to them domestically. So Luke, that's specifically for you. Should we really lend a helping hand and offer the underfinanced scientists now and give them access to our institutions and funding?
Well, I think it's what Olga described, of course, is exactly I would say, even though it's about individuals, it are individuals who are within an institutional setting, which indeed dates back to the Soviet Union. And it's an institutional setting which, if I may say so, I often found also in some of our East European countries. Before, and done the evaluation in Bulgaria, in many other of the science and technology system, and you would see the same thing of people, very old scientists in general, having been appointed in the same way as Olga described. So I take Olga's point very much on that line. But the question is, of course, whether in the young generation of new scientists, where open science, where we have open access, where you have refereeing procedures which are at the global level, where data sharing is required, whether this basis is not the counter poison, so to say, towards all the attempts at spinning dictators, social media influencing, etc. And for me, I still believe that, you know, I agree with you, this distinction between the scientists. There were lots of Nobel Prizes and Nobel Prize winners which were racists, which were most had views which were absolutely unacceptable in these days. Yeah. So there is a strong difference between an individual and indeed the science system. But our science system has moved in a direction whereby I would say science integrity is intrinsically part of every nation in the world. And every scientist, whether he's in Russia, China, South Africa, or Europe, has to satisfy those criteria. That, for me, is a basis by which we should continue to keep open science as a feature whereby we can address primarily global issues from those science, not the local dimensions in these countries, etc., for sure. But on the global side, I still believe strongly that open science and global science contributions are absolutely essential.
All right. Matthew, do you want to add anything? Then I'll come back to you.
Well, just to reinforce what Luke was just saying and coming back to picking up on something that Don also mentioned. I think there's also an opportunity in a world where geopolitics is fracturing, and you mentioned that, and there's the emergence of new blocks of interests. Maybe there's an opportunity in using science as a track to diplomatic tool and using scientific collaboration in times of conflicts and fractured world as one of the areas where some bridges are maintained, so that once we move to a new context, we can use those bridges and then rebuild collaboration beyond the scientific realm. I think there's an opportunity there to use science as an important pivotal track to diplomacy.
Since you have the floor, and I guess I think this is one of the recommendations that came out in your report, right? In the report from your own conference on the crisis. since you have the floor, do you want to give us just a snapshot of the other recommendations, just in a couple of minutes?
Yeah, I can take a few minutes if I have those. Be happy to do so. As I said when I started, clearly our efforts, our energy has to go on Ukraine. Has to be about, how do we help Ukrainian scientists, refugee and displaced scientists? What are their needs? And the International Science Council, working with a lot of partners, I'm not going to mention them all, but that includes a lot of stakeholders in Ukraine, Science for Ukraine, the ministry, the academies, the All European Academies Network, and other networks of academies, organized a one-day workshop conference. About 150 people participated, half of which were Ukrainian displaced and refugee scientists, people working at the ministry or in universities, just trying to address that very issues. What was interesting is that what came out of that conference, and in the weeks following the conference, trying to come up with good recommendations, actually speak beyond the situation in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. It's actually a roadmap almost for what we could call a blueprint for the international scientific community to better address crises and situations where we're facing refugee and displaced scientists, and let be in massive numbers, and let's all be clear and not be naive. Those situations will continue in the coming years. So recognizing the issue, first of all, that refugee and displaced scientists, helping them, supporting them in the best way we can, is absolutely central for the global scientific community, was one of the big recommendations coming out of this conference. Look, mobility is at the core of anything we're going to do. We need to be able to have quick and flexible mechanism to help individual scientists to move, change countries, and come in host countries and continue working. And here it's important that we force countries to honor their commitments. I'm going to take the example of my own country, Canada, so it's not too problematic. Canada has made great pledges and is willing to honor them, but there's a lot of bureaucracies, and we just know that there's not a lot of Ukrainian scientists in the end are making it to Canada. So we need to force countries to deliver on their national commitment. Mobility, however, is not the whole story, clearly, and we must recognize that the needs of refugee and displaced scientists are different according to their own personal situation, according to their gender, family situation, whether they're part of a national minority or not. So the needs are different, and they will evolve through time. It's one thing to address the immediate crisis situation, and it's another thing to address their needs of refugee and displaced scientists through a longer period of time. So we need inclusive programs of support. We need that recognize different situations, and we need flexible.
Can I ask you to wrap up in 1 minute?
Yeah. Then predictability, preparation is key. So we need programs that address the 3 typical standard phases of humanitarian crisis: preparation, crisis, and rebuilding. And we need blueprints. We need to be able to have policy frameworks that we're going to be able to roll out in the future. The good news is that as a global scientific community, there's a lot we can do ourselves. And we realize that in helping refugee and displaced scientists publishing. We need to publish more interrupted studies. We need to allow more scientists attend international conferences, even though they're not ready to present a full paper, so interrupted studies in conferences. There's a lot we can do in terms of making sure that refugee and displaced scientists get lab space, lab time, or are able to review articles, or maintain into the global scientific enterprise. The smaller the time they're spending out of the professional scientific enterprise, the easier it is to rebuild. So there's a lot we can do as scientific community, but we cannot do everything by ourselves. And here it's important to force our national government, and here, turning to Yuku and Don, force our national governments to honor the legal instruments that they've signed on to. Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UNESCO status on research and researchers that give us the legal instruments to favor mobility and helping refugee and displaced scientists.
Thank you, Mathieu. We're running just 1 minute late, and actually, I'm going to wrap up, and I just want to apologize to the online audience because we are a couple of minutes late. But yeah, Mathieu, you referred to the importance of national government to be involved. Yuko, I'll come to you just for 30 seconds. The ScienceBusiness so-called technology strategy board that you're part of, we are publishing today as well a report that is being shared online, and we'll distribute as well paper copies here in Brussels, so you can have one. But I think there is one of the recommendations from this report was a potential role for the European Commission, if I'm not wrong. So do you want us to end on that note, and then we will wrap up? Yuko.
Thank you. Very quickly, we have 3 recommendations. One is start with the evidence. We need to know as objective as possible the consequences of science sanctions. And not only in the short term, but implication mid and longer term, implication on science, the practice of science, the value of science. Second is engage the global research communities. The sanction is sanctioning Russia, but by ricochet, impacting ourselves. So the way we are doing science is impacting. So as primary concerned stakeholders, all of us researchers, we have to express our voice to really show where we are and what we want. And also, we should be parts of taking actions. And that's why we both encourage and mobilize researchers to work together for this endeavor. The last point, government should work collectively to agree on a long-term strategy for the conduct of science in the time in war, in the conflict. This is most difficult to take actions. But we are not desperate. Based on what we are actually experiencing today, we see much more needs for collaboration among governments.
All right.
So what we expect is moving ahead with the collaborations. We have already some first action, ongoing discussion on research integrity and security issues. Several countries are engaged and group of countries are working on, but we recommend to go beyond, to engage more countries, to talk together, to work collaboratively based on the evidence we have been gathering and taking account of the voice of research community.
Very good.
And this as an initial step toward commonly agreed, ideally, guiding principle for the conduct of science in wartime. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yuko. So there's plenty of concrete recommendations. I'm